Many consider the South to have been the hotbed of racial inequality and tension throughout U.S. history, especially during the Civil Rights Movement, which largely took place during the middle part of the 20th century. However, this way of thinking relies on the misinformed notion that the North was inherently less racist due to things like the popular abolitionist movement and the lack of Jim Crow laws later on. The fact of the matter is that in the North, especially in New England, there was simply a much smaller population of people of color in general, a legacy that is continued to this very day. Slavery wasn't a necessary component of the Northern economy, which contributed to the acceptance of the abolition movement in the North. Furthermore, segregation, a system meant to show one's dominance and superiority over another, simply was never a necessity for racist white Northerners, but de facto segregation was common. It wasn't unheard of for people of color to be refused lodging or service in white establishments in the North, even during the Civil Rights era. In fact, there was actually a book which existed for this very reason, titled the Negro Motorist Green Book. This guidebook was established in 1936 and ran through 1966. In this 1949 facsimile issue, it is stated that the guide serves to keep the Negro traveler from running into difficulties, embarrassments, and to make his trips more enjoyable. The book includes southern as well as northern states and relies on business owners, or goers, to contact the writers and have their businesses listed. Interestingly, New Hampshire is not included in this edition, probably due to the incredible difficulty of finding housing and eating establishments for people of color mixed with the low population of New Hampshire to begin with. Enter Rock Rest. Rock Rest was the name of an inn located at Kittery Point, Maine, and owned by Hazel and Clayton Sinclair. This inn is not found in the Motorist Green Book edition of 1949, as it relied on word of mouth from friends and former visitors for its business. It is possible that the Sinclairs simply didn't want the exposure of their business in the Green Book, or that the writers were unable to get around to including their business, considering that the writers say there are hundreds of first-class business places that we don't know about and can't list. But it is unlikely that the Sinclairs were unaware of the book's existence, due to its importance for traveling people of color. Rock Rest was opened in 1940 by Hazel and Clayton in Kittery Point, Maine, right next to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and very near to beaches like Old Orchard and York. These locations, being hotspots for summer festivities, required lots of help during the summers, with a lot of that help coming from African Americans who traveled north for the summer work. Jewel Inn at York Beach was actually opened for the very purpose of hosting this help. Unlike Jewel Inn, letters suggest that Rock Rest was better known by African American tourists hoping to enjoy some of the festivities in New Hampshire and Maine. Word about Rock Rest was spread by these visitors, who would tell their friends about the lovely, secluded location, the fantastic food, and the phenomenal hosts. At its height in 1963, Rock Rest served as many as 12 guests at one time. Clayton states of the inn in one periodical, "My wife does the cooking and I do the work." Hazel, Clayton's wife, was actually known for her catering and her excellent cooking, which is mentioned in various articles, and by Valerie Cunningham, a former maid employed by Hazel and Clayton. According to Mrs. Cunningham, Hazel cooked using fresh vegetables from her garden and fresh eggs from her chickens. All in all, the inn was marked equally by its quality of food as it was by the exceptional service provided by the Sinclairs. Although there were some strict rules requiring guests to turn out their lights and to remain quiet after dark, guests often escaped to Jewel Inn for a night of dancing. Still, Clayton and Hazel were extremely personable, with guests often leaving their thanks in the guest book, saying things like, "I'm glad of the privilege to wake up in your home," and "wishing you both luck, happiness, and success." It should be noted that the story of Rock Rest relies on the fortunate circumstances of the Sinclair family having saved all documents, pictures, and things relating to the inn. Too often, African American stories have been lost to the racist tides of history, which have so often erased the accomplishments of African Americans or attributed them to white men. However, in this case, not only were the documents saved, but the house itself remains intact. Valerie Cunningham, the former employee of the Sinclairs, actually is now an important player for the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail, having played an important role in the salvation of Rock Rest and in its conversion into a historical landmark. Mrs. Cunningham's testimony is also strong evidence which confirms the purpose of the Sinclair's home. According to Mrs. Cunningham, in 1957 there was not one black teacher, store clerk, grocery checker, accountant, telephone operator, doctor, or lawyer. in the Seacoast area. She continues that because de facto segregation was an unwritten practice, unlike in the South where interracial intermingling was prohibited by law, African Americans could never be certain they would be accepted or rejected when seeking services. There was a need for the service that the Sinclairs were providing, but they were never happy merely with offering a partial solution to the issue. They were fighting for equal rights from the start. Their inn was merely a halfway point in that fight. Mrs. Cunningham fondly remembers that at Rock Rest, racial politics were always on the agenda. Furthermore, she mentions that no matter the conversation, it inevitably would turn to some race-related topic. It was, and remains, a distinct characteristic of African American society not experienced among white groups. Mrs. Cunningham's testimony confirms the passion and pride that the Sinclairs had both in their inn, and more importantly, in their race and in their fight for equality. Along with a bevy of documents, letters, testimony, and newspaper articles are photographs, seen previously. These photographs eradicate any doubts about what the inn really did, having served many different black families. There are various photographs of people of color at Rock Rest, and even one photograph which possibly depicts a white family. It is impossible to know whether or not they are, but still this is an extremely interesting possibility. It would not be contrary to the nature of the Sinclairs to allow all visitors, no matter their race. Their lives were defined by a fight for equality, rather than superiority. So why the Sinclairs? What were they about? What were their motivations behind creating Rock Rest? Well, we have already touched on this somewhat with the testimony from Mrs. Cunningham, who recalls how important racial politics were to the Sinclairs. It is clear from that testimony that Hazel and Clayton wanted the best for people with skin that was not white, something that is confirmed through the other ventures and accomplishments in both of their lives. An NAACP program from 1961 states that, in 1957, Clayton undertook the task of organizing a branch of the association in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. His obituaries further confirm his involvement, all of which emphasizing his role as a founding member. One newspaper article mentions he also served as a treasurer for many years, as does a copy of an NAACP program from 1961. Clayton was all about equality and gaining the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and Hazel was no different. Not only was Clayton a founding member of the Portsmouth branch of the NAACP, but he was also a member of the Negro Masons in Boston. He can be found on a 1949 roster of Freemasons at UNH Special Collections. In the Sinclair family collection at UNH, one can find a book on Negro Masonry gifted to Clayton, as well as a newspaper clipping which mentions that the Negro Masons finally gained recognition in 1947. The article states that in Boston, Negro Masons here brought documentary proof that they had as much right to recognition as the white branch of the lodge. Clayton Jr. even sent a letter of thanks to the Masons for attending his father's funeral. The struggle faced in getting recognition for the Negro Masons was a struggle that defined Clayton's life, and Hazel's too. However, both Sinclairs were also defined by their intense passion and their roles in bettering the lives of other people of color, often being at the forefront of movements like that which earned the Negro Masons recognition. The Sinclairs were involved very much in their community. They were even important members of the first desegregated church in Portsmouth. In the 1947 minutes of a meeting discussing the 1948 Emancipation Program, both Clayton and Hazel are mentioned as serving the committee. Clayton actually opened the first meeting with a hymn. It seems fitting that the Sinclairs were recorded by the church preparing a program which was to be about the freedom of African Americans. One can be certain that what they prepared was a program which showed thanks for the improved conditions for African Americans, but also one which was not completely satisfied, due to the problems they were still fighting, problems which led to the creation of things like the Portsmouth NAACP, Rock Rest, and a Negro Masonry. Hazel and Clayton Sinclair were your classic Renaissance men. They were involved in many different ventures and were intuitive business people. One of those ventures was the film Lost Boundaries. Lost Boundaries is a film which was recorded in Portsmouth. Both Clayton and Hazel earned small roles in the film, as the directors looked for extras from the Portsmouth area. The film was based on a novel of the same name. Interestingly, the main struggle of the novel is similar to the struggle that the Sinclairs seemed to feel. The characters did not feel at home. They weren't equal. In the novel, which is based on a true story, a New England physician who is passing as white attempts to join the Navy. He is rejected due to being a Negro, as they word it in the novel. and decides to tell the family secret to his children. The following passage pertains to his son. He was proud to be colored, only what exactly did being colored mean? Naturally, he would not hurt his father's career by telling anyone. But suppose he did tell people. How many of those things could he still do? In just what places could he eat or spend a night? How many of the girls he knew could he call for a date? And what would they say if they knew? The film follows along the same plot as the novel, but hardly meets the point of the original novel. The irony is that the film itself didn't do much to advance the position of people of color, going so far as to cast white men to play the roles of the passing African Americans and skewing the message at the end of the film. Rather than saying it's okay to be black, the message is more like it's okay to be black if you look white enough and your neighbors are okay with it. One critic, Seymour Peck, points out, disturbing factor about boundaries is, it approaches Dr. Carter with an air of condescension. One might expect him to be a man of fierce pride in his race, its culture, yet he goes through the picture feeling ashamed and guilty. Peck ends by saying, if Doc Carter had been dark, could he have practiced medicine in that town in the first place? Peck's criticism isn't that it would be impossible for a black person to feel the way portrayed in the film, but more that it would be better to portray a proud black man who ends up feeling empowered through the acceptance of his race, rather than a man who is ashamed to not be truly white. Ironically, the negative portrayal of the film's main character is the type of portrayal Clayton and Hazel were fighting to shed throughout all their lives, which makes their involvement interesting. But at the time of the film, many of the themes still would have been very progressive, making their involvement understandable. Now flash forward to Clayton Sr.'s grandson. I quickly want to talk about 3 letters included in the Sinclair family papers at UNH Special Collections. These Hallmark-style cards or letters each feature a black person on the cover, 2 of whom are smiling children, and 1 a smiling older man. These letters really draw together what the Sinclairs were all about, representation and equality. This family was proud of their heritage and was extremely adamant about teaching their friends and family that their race was not something to be ashamed of, but rather a defining part about who they were. The legacy of the Sinclairs lives on in future generations. It may seem mundane and unimportant, but it is a big deal to have an identity and pride in who you are, especially when society implicitly tells you that you are inferior and unimportant so often.